Do you want to know how to speak English more fluently? Would you like to know the strategy or method for learning a language more effectively? And are you dying to know what resources can help you to practice any language like English that you're learning? If you answered yes to all those questions, well, make sure you watch this video because I'm going to interview a polyglot, Steve Kaufmann, who can speak 20 languages, 20. Wow. And he's going to share with us his secrets about how to learn any language. Are you ready? Let's go. So, how many languages do you speak?
You know, I claim to speak 20 languages, right? So you can't maintain 20 languages at the same level. So I would say that half of those I could speak right now. We could get into a conversation on a variety of subjects and I'd make mistakes in some of them, but I'd manage. And I think this is for people who learn multiple languages. I think you can keep, a handful ready to use at a decent level anytime. And others you have to go back in and refresh. But refresh is like a few hours. It's not like another 6 months. You go in there and you very quickly kind of retrace some of the things that you did before. The neural connections are refreshed back at
clicks.
So it clicks. So on that basis, as long as I'm not challenged to make a speech in Czech, 20, half of which are usable now.
All right. Well, just because, just to kind of get an idea of, let's say, the expertise you have, it seems quite good and quite profound. So one of the trigger words or one of the buzzwords, let's say, that I always hear from my students or people that follow me is fluency, right? So just wondering, how can I speak fluently in a language, right? That's the question I always get. What do you think is the secret to becoming fluent in a language?
Well, first of all, any language other than our own, maybe even in our own, but certainly in other languages, we're constantly improving. So you never hit the level. Now I have it, I can put the language away in my pocket, it's done. So you're always improving. To me, fluency means that you can have a comfortable conversation with someone, that person is comfortable, is not limiting the words they use or how they express themselves because you're a non-native speaker. You're comfortable, even though you make mistakes, you're not self-conscious about using the language, but you know that you make mistakes. But fluency doesn't mean no mistakes. Mm-hmm. Fluency, I think it refers to the range of subjects you can discuss and the level of comfort at both ends of the conversation.
Yeah. I think the problem with that question that I get all the time is it just seems like people are not enjoying the process. They're not enjoying the journey. It's just like, how can I get from A to B and then, be done with it? Whereas I feel like people should just think about, okay, how can I have fun with this? How can I speak with more people? It seems like the wrong question for me, but what would you say to people who maybe are focused too much on fluency or just that's their main goal?
So, of course, the situation with people who learn English is different from the situation of people learning other languages often, let's say. A lot of times, people learning other languages are learning them out of interest, whereas with English, it's often part of their work. And certainly, I have worked with many people in both their language and in English, and especially in countries like Sweden or Germany, those people speak English very, very well, but they all use phrasing structures that reflect Swedish or German all the time. Okay. They're not self-conscious about it at all. We have a business discussion, he uses a Swedishism or a Germanism, and everybody's happy. So I think those sort of proficient second language speakers of English who use it for business, for practical reasons, they don't worry about how well they speak. They just use the language. Someone who is a deliberate student of the language is fussed about, am I really fluent? I'm not as fluent as I would like to be. I'm looking for words. I forgot words. I think you need to get past that. The language is a tool. It's a tool for listening, for watching a movie, for listening to music or songs, for all those things, reading a book. And just enjoy it. And if you treat the language as something you enjoy doing, you will improve.
In terms of something that I struggle with learning languages, I speak English. I was born in Oxford in the UK. And then I learned Japanese as I moved to Japan and I learned Japanese. Mm-hmm. And I think the big mistake I made was just focusing on grammar. I went really hard on grammar. I thought, okay, if I do another textbook and another textbook, then, I'll be able to speak and be fluent or whatever. And then when I started to learn Spanish, I kind of took a different approach where it was like, okay, just get the foundations down and now I'll just use everything I have and just keep using it and see what happens. So I still now think that from my point of view, I'm a little bit lost on what's the best way to learn a language. What's the most effective way to learn a language? What do you think?
I'm very much sort of in favor of input-based learning. I believe with Stephen Krashen that we learn the language from meaningful input, messages that are important to us. So if you're given a boring text read by a boring narrator out of a beginner book, the first time, yeah, it's new, it's different. So to that extent, it's interesting to the brain because it's new. But after a while, you can't deal with that stuff. So what I find is that you need, to my mind, you spend 80% of your time at least on what I would call top-down learning, listening and reading and speaking. In other words, just a sort of big picture involvement with the language. And then you can choose to spend 10, 15, 20% of your time on specific details. Now, you can do that because you're in a classroom with a teacher. You can do that reading a grammar book. You can do that doing quizzes, because there are things that we miss. So you're gathering all of this vocabulary, you're getting more, better and better level of comprehension, but you miss things. And so if you then go in and every so often you're curious about, just when actually do we use the subjunctive? Even though you might recognize it or you might use it correctly at times and not at other times. So you look it up and you see the explanation. But having looked up the explanation makes you a little more conscious of that issue. Yet the next time you go to speak, you'll still get it wrong. Okay, that's the important thing. And over time, gradually, you naturally sort of move into naturally using. And that part of that is noticing it, and part of that is explanation. But overwhelmingly, it's the fact that you've seen it in different contexts, so that now there is a natural pattern.
I think once you just start to accept that you might not fully understand it, but just try and feel it, it's fine. Nobody really cares that much.
Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Like if a non-English speaker constantly doesn't use an article, like there are languages that don't have articles. So obviously those speakers don't have the habit of using articles. So they don't use an article. Doesn't bother anyone in a native speaker. It doesn't matter.
In terms of like those different areas, let's say grammar, pronunciation, different areas, what would you normally work on first? Like, because a lot of people like say the traditional form is grammar. Like I've experienced it working in Japanese schools and in the UK and also in Spain and in Peru as well. Everything first is like, okay, well, let's do the present simple, let's do the past simple, and everything will be fine after. But do you feel differently about this?
Oh yeah, I think that's hopeless. A lot of the grammar explanations, unless you have had a lot of exposure to the language, your brain has a lot of experience with the language, half those explanations, you don't believe them. Try explaining English tenses to someone with very little knowledge of English. They don't understand what you're talking about. So far better to just expose yourself to a lot of the language, begin to develop some habits, begin to acquire some words, begin to develop a level of comprehension. Later on, you can go in, maybe using the target language and read about the grammar. It may help. It does help to some extent. But I think that the emphasis on grammar up front in traditional language instruction is so bad.
Yeah, well, because you talked a lot about input and just sort of exposing yourself, and that helps you to feel a bit more natural. What kind of resources would you normally recommend, or what do you use yourself?
Well, I mean, I use links. So I start in a new language. This was the case with Persian and Arabic, and it'll be the case when I start trying Hindi in a couple of months. So I start with the mini stories. 60 mini stories. Every word or verb repeats about 5 times, but in a different form. So the story is, by the third time you're listening to it, you know exactly what the story is about, but you're starting to get a sense of the patterns. So I will spend 3 months, depending on how different the writing system is, because a writing system is a big obstacle, because I believe in listening and reading. Well, if you can't read, then the reading part of it isn't there. So the reading is a bit of a problem, but a lot of exposure to relatively simple material with a lot of repetition. I will get myself a book, a starter book, Teach Yourself, colloquial, one of those. Just gives me an overview of the grammar. An overview means I'm not expecting to remember any of the grammatical explanations, but it's a bit of exposure to the grammar. So that's my first 3 to 6 months. And thereafter, I go out looking for interesting content, which I can find on YouTube, I can find podcasts. And nowadays, you can go to ChatGPT and say, find me a podcast in Spanish on the subject of educating children. Yeah. There's a podcast on that subject. And I can bring any podcast, any MP3 file, I can automatically transcribe using AI. So I can bring it in as a lesson to link, and I go through and I pick out the words and try to make my way through this content. So I try to move within 3 to 6 months. We'll see how it goes with Hindi. I try to move into authentic, interesting content, because the brain likes new things and the brain likes important or relevant things. So this new is surprisingly important. So to summarize, the first 3 to 6 months on very simple content with a lot of repetition to get a bit of a grip on the language. And then I try to push myself into genuine, interesting content, because in the long run, that's going to sustain me.
Yeah, I think that's really true about motivation. I've seen it so many times in my classes about IELTS. It's like it can be quite monotonous just going through the exam and, you know, talking about subjects they're not really interested in, whether that's the environment or, I don't know, crime or something. And you can see them sort of fade after like 2 months. You're like, come on, just 1 more month and then you're going to take the test. But it's so true about, you know, you're not going to learn a language, reading about something that's not what you're interested in, right?
Oh.
Whether that's, I don't know, whatever topic. So what kind of, talking about that as being a mistake maybe that people often make, what common mistakes do you often see or notice that students make when they learn a language?
I think students put too much pressure on themselves. They have unrealistic expectations. It takes time. With enough exposure, the brain will gradually learn more and more. It'll form new habits for that new language, but the brain learns slowly. So don't put unrealistic expectations on yourself. Don't think you can nail down certain things. Some of the most basic things that you learn very early on, you will continue to get wrong. Don't worry about it. So I think those kinds of unrealistic expectations create pressure, frustration. So that's a problem. I think they have to try to move into enjoyment gear. So the first, okay, you're going up the hill, you've got it in, first gear, you're working hard. You have to get to that level now where you're not learning as much new stuff. You may not feel you're progressing, but it's easier now. You're able to watch movies. You're able to enjoy the language. And if you can get yourself to that level, you can get up that first steep climb and you get now to the plateau, which may seem endless, but at least it's not as much hard work. And then just put yourself in a situation where you can enjoy the language and don't second guess yourself and don't worry about what you forget. It's normal to forget.
What do you think about that in terms of forgetting words? Especially a lot of students tell me like, I'm having a conversation and I can't remember the word, or if I'm having a class with a student, I'll mention the word. They're like, oh yes, I knew that word, but it's just not there. Like, how can you make these words sort of stick more?
You can't. First of all, every time you forget a word and relearn it, you're on your way to learning that word. Research shows that forgetting and relearning is important, an important part of the process. You then grab it stronger, better. So that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Second of all, your peak memory apparently is at the age of 25. And from the age of 45 on, your memory declines. Now, I have learned 10 languages since the age of 60. So no doubt my memory has declined. You don't rely on memory so much. You rely on creating habits. These habits are created through exposure, through learning, forgetting. So it gets back to my point about people put too much pressure on themselves. Why worry about what you forget? You're going to forget. And as you get older, you're going to forget more and more. That doesn't mean you aren't learning the language.
The more you worry as well, the more you forget.
And if you put pressure on yourself, guaranteed you're not going to. Maybe after that conversation, you'll walk away and you'll remember the word. But in the conversation, you couldn't remember it.
Yeah. What in terms of, as someone who has learned many languages, if you think about daily things you can do, what kind of habits do you think are good for learning a language like English?
So I have a routine. I like to listen. It's the easiest thing to do. I pop in my AirPods. I can be doing the dishes. I can be, running. I can be driving. I can listen. So to get in the habit of listening is a good thing. When you listen, you're going to understand, depending on, the content and your level, anywhere from, 10% to 80%. And I go and read. Whatever I listen to, I read. And I look up words. So that doesn't mean I've now aced that so that the next time I listen to it, I'll understand it more. No, but it's part of consuming the language. I think a good habit is to get in the habit of listening and reading. Obviously, you speak whenever you have the opportunity.
Do you think it's possible to become fluent or maybe even more bilingual, for example, without living abroad, without living in that specific country?
It's possible. I always say to speak well, you need to speak a lot. So if you create conditions where you can speak a lot without going to the country, sure. When I go to these language polyglot conferences, there are people there, they may or may not have lived in the country, but many of them are very fluent. So it's possible, but it's obviously easier. But the only thing I would say is if you're going to go to the country to learn the language, make sure you arrive with a certain, a halfway decent level in the language. Otherwise, you may develop the habit of living in English, say, in that country.
Yeah, it's very tempting, I think, especially with English. Well, I think most people don't have this problem who are learning English, non-natives, because normally they sort of switch to English to get by. Even when I sort of sometimes speak in Spanish, people respond in English, or maybe if I'm struggling with a word, then they switch to English, and then it's like the rhythm is kind of broken. But
Well, the other thing too is that you like a person learning a language, you're learning Spanish, you want to practice your Spanish. Maybe that person wants to practice his or her English. So
yeah,
you have to write to him, I'm learning Spanish, so you've got to speak to me in Spanish.
yeah, it's very true. Something I wanted to touch on, going back to mistakes just a little quickly, was about knowing different languages. Like, how do you not mix languages that maybe seem similar to each other?
Oh, I do, of course. Mix in terms of vocabulary, mix in terms of structure, mix in terms of pronunciation. Of course you do. The more you spend in, say, Italian, you'll mix in less and less Spanish. And eventually it becomes more and more Italian. If you then go back to a Spanish environment, you'll bring with you some Italian habits and they'll become less prominent. So it's one of these things that I don't worry about those problems. It's like, how do you maintain your languages? I don't worry about it. How do you avoid making mistakes? I make mistakes. You can't be a perfectionist. Similar languages help you, but there is some interference. So yeah, you get interference from related or even unrelated languages.
And I actually asked my students to give me a question. What would you want to ask a polyglot? And this surprisingly, this one came up many times, maybe six or seven times. So I'll finish off with this one. What language do you dream in?
Well, to the extent that we're conscious of the language we're using when we're dreaming, we're just in the dream, right? But yeah, overwhelmingly English. But if somebody shows up who's Japanese or French or whatever, that character will speak their language. But to the extent that I'm conscious of narrating my dream, it's going to be in English.
So you wouldn't sort of switch to another language from your perspective in a dream?
No. However, if I'm saying something to myself and I'm in Japan, say this would only happen with languages that I speak very well. But if I happen to be in Japan, I've spent the whole day speaking Japanese, or I'm in France, I've spent the whole day speaking French, possibly Spanish. It's possible that I would say something to myself in that language in the dream.
Interesting. All right, brilliant. Well, thanks for your time, Steve, and all the best with LinkU.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, so that's everything for this video. I hope you found it really informative and you got some great tips to help you improve your English. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, smash the like button and I'll see you next time.